All right. Well, welcome to Convergent's Economic Development Pulse webinar series, where we work to keep our finger and yours on the pulse of trends that are emerging for economic developers and economic development organizations around the country. I'm excited today to have Bethany Quinn, president of Golden Shovel Agency, joining us, and Mark Bergethon, principal at Convergent. And we are going to walk through strategies for building workforce housing. So, Mark, Bethany, grateful to have both of you here to share. And I will turn it over to the two of you and let you jump into things.
Great. Thanks for having us here today, Brian and Mark. We're really excited to share just some best practices of what we are seeing throughout the country as people look to build more workforce housing. So I do want to just highlight some of the things that we're going to be going over today for the audience. So we are going to be looking at what are some of the data on housing right now, both in the Midwest and throughout the country. What are we doing to successfully market to developers? What best practices are working to build more housing? And of course, this is a Convergent webinar, so I can't wait to hear from Mark and what Convergent's doing to raise money and some of the resources that are available. All right, you guys. So I'm going to go ahead and start by talking about what some of the statistics are for the situation in 2025. So if you were to look at this nice graph right here, this is put out by Realtor.com and their economist. And you can see, depending on where you're located in the country, based on the housing starts that are available right now, so what permits are being issued in your region, how long is it going to take to close the housing gap? So at the very top, we see that the southern states, they have the most housing starts by region right now. They are performing fairly well. They could close their housing gap in 3 years. So for anyone who is on this webinar that happens to be in one of the southern states, really good job. But authentically, we all should be following the model that southern states are putting out, because 3 years to close the housing gap is actually quite remarkable. And that has come from a lot of concerted efforts by people such as yourself. The Western states could close the gap in 6.5 years. That feels a little bit too long, but still comparatively, you're on the right track. The biggest challenges come in the Midwest and the Northeast, where we're looking at in the Midwest alone, 41 years to close that housing gap. The Northeast is around the same. So the reality is, unless you're in one of the southern states who's making some great progress on housing already, this is something that needs to be at the very top of the list for your strategic planning activities and what you get people to really support in your community. So there are some factors that we have seen across the board that are slowing housing development down. Golden Shovel, just as a refresher, we are an economic development strategy and communications firm. Because of that, we actually interview quite a few developers on the residential side, site selectors, and builders. So we hear a lot of information, and that's some of the things that we have heard are slowing development down and making areas not necessarily interesting for developers on the housing development side. One of which, of course, is a lack of land ready for development. It's really important to treat residential sites with the same level of care and preparation that you have been treating industrial sites for all these years, right? Being able to identify the land for development and get it shovel ready, but this time shovel ready for residential development. That's going to be very useful. If there's high impact fees in your areas, those can be deciding factors that make housing developers go elsewhere. If there is a slow permitting process, a lack of appetite for multifamily, and of course that could be lower density like duplexes and triplexes as well, but being able to build more than one home on a single lot. And then, of course, there's things you can't control like high material cost and interest rates. So we like to try to encourage folks to focus on what they can do and not worry as much about the rest. So some of the things that you can do that make it easier to develop in your community are to look at what financial incentives can be offered. This is where Mark and Convergent definitely play such a key role in being able to make it more appetizing to develop in a certain area. Waiving impact fees, things of that nature. Also, when you are able to handle the offsite infrastructure in advance, make sure that there are low regulation requirements, such as if there does need to be an environmental report, get it done yourself ahead of time so the developer doesn't have to deal with it. Making sure there's flexible zoning laws and that you allow for multiple types of home development, such as prefab, modular, or even container homes, can definitely be useful as far as spurring development. So one of the things that we like to highlight is you know you need housing, that's why you're here. So what do you do to actively market your community to housing developers who can help to solve that challenge? So this is really a three-step process if you want to break it down on the communication side. It starts with conducting a housing studies so that you can actually have data to back up why developing homes in your community is a good business opportunity to housing developers that you're communicating with. Remember, they're in the business of building homes to make money, right? So you want to try to demonstrate that there is low risk to doing so in your community. The more need you can demonstrate using data, the less risk they have. And then, of course, you need to prepare marketing materials. We're going to talk about the different types you should prepare and start conducting outreach. There is so much opportunity for developers right now that you can't count on them coming and finding you. You have to be able to go to them with data and a compelling story. So as an example, Jen Hall, an economic developer in Greater Beloit, talked about how the housing study was used to help her have conversations with housing developers and demonstrate there was an immediate real need. So that housing study itself needs to include a needs assessment. So what do you need today? And it's not just number of units, right? But what type? How many single family? How many multifamily? What size? How many homes do you need in senior housing? How many in executive? How many homes need to be sold versus how many need to be available to rent? So it's really important to break this down at the granular level because when you have this level of data, for one, it helps you to understand what you need to do on the site preparation and infrastructure side, and it also demonstrates to housing developers that you really are able to demonstrate that the niche that they build, there's a need for that in your community. And then you also need to anticipate current needs, but also future needs. So as an organization, obviously you're tasked with growing the economy and creating jobs. So if you have those wins, how is that going to impact how many units that you need? And then, of course, what is the price tolerance? What can your community support? This is really important to evaluate because if a developer comes in and builds something absolutely gorgeous, but nobody can afford the mortgage, it's going to sit there vacant and that doesn't help anyone. So really important to evaluate that. And then, of course, what sites are available to develop the homes based on the size and the price point you identified? What is the zoning for where they can go? What infrastructure is in place to support them? And what incentives can be used to make it more affordable to develop? That should all be part of your housing study. These can take 3 to 6 months to develop, but it's very important to go through this process. Once you have your marketing materials need to tell the story of why here. Remember, you are in intense competition to get developers to come to your community. So we need to make it really clear from the beginning why this is a good business opportunity based on the demands and needs, the supportive pro-business environment, and the fact that your community is an amazing place to live, right? Demonstrating that quality of life is very valuable for housing developers. Once you have your why, you need to write articles and publish them regularly to tell that story. Also, you should have video created showcasing your quality of life, because if you're a housing developer, you're not just selling a home, you're selling a lifestyle, you're selling a location. So they need to see this is a location that will support the value of these homes that are being built. You need original photography. That's critical for your ad campaign, your social media campaign. It should be of your community. And I always want to recommend, as a pro tip, make sure that the pictures that are gathered have people's smiling faces. As humans, we tend to stop scrolling when we see another face versus just a picture of home construction, right? That's not going to be as compelling. It's far more compelling to see the actual company building it and their faces, or even better, the people moving in. So make sure you get that photography. And then once you have those things in place, you have your why, you have your story, you have your captivating video and photography assets, you need to make sure that you create social media graphics, brochures that are used for print and digital, ad graphics, and social media videos and ads. So that way you can actually conduct outreach to the very housing developers you want in your community. As an example of that working very recently, so Justin Summer, he is the Economic Development Director in Preble County, Ohio, ran a talent attraction and developer attraction campaign for them, complete with all of the things we just discussed. And within several months, they have 100 new homes that are being built in their community. So that is a huge win, definitely a testament to Justin and his efforts, but also to the fact that this process works. So we highly recommend following it. All right, before we go into best practices, I'm going to take a drink of water. All right, so these are some really cool stories of positive momentum that is being experienced throughout the country as economic developers are using innovative ideas to attract development. Also, cool fun fact, a lot of these are Convergent clients as well. So Mark, if you have more to add to any of these stories, feel free to jump in. So I wanted to give this example of a community who had a former industrial site that needed to be cleaned up. A lot of communities have these throughout the country. This was a former meat packing site, and they were able to secure some grant funding from the state and also use tax increment financing to develop a multifamily home complex that is going to serve as an anchor or foundation for an entire redeveloped site that's going to have office and retail and a variety of things. But the benefit is they're immediately able to provide housing for their community. And if you have a site like this, there is cleanup funding that will make it easier for you to actually do something with this land and repurpose it. As a benefit, when you look at making a case to stakeholders, you can see their land value went from 52,000 to 2.99 million. So when you're looking at it from a tax revenue perspective, this is a type of strategy that has long-term benefits for the whole community. Another really cool success story is something that happened in Nebraska. Jordan Dietrich, he's with TCDA. He downloaded a golden shovel white paper that talked about how to build more housing in your community. We have that free resource available to everyone. And one of the recommended strategies that was being done a lot in Canada was building container home communities. And people think of container homes and they think of something that might not be super attractive, but that's not the case. They can look like a normal single family home. The benefit is they can be constructed primarily inside of a building using manufacturing processes, which means that weather is not going to slow down the construction of these homes. It also means that there is less waste, so they're built more efficiently and faster. So Jordan was able to get information on this and approached a manufacturing company in their community, Aulick Industries, who embraced the idea and is developing an entire residential neighborhood made of container homes. So the benefit to the community is jobs are being created at a local manufacturing company, new homes are being built. You can see actually this picture of a restroom, the bathroom that's inside one of these container homes. It is beautiful, modern, and looks better than mine. So I'm telling you, they did a great job. And as another bonus, they are actually training kids in the community in the trades. So the local high school kids are actually learning how to be an electrician by working on some container homes, just a couple a year. But they're getting those skills, right? They have plumbing and they're learning how to do drywalling and framing and all these different things. And everyone watching or listening to this knows that we have a desperate need for skilled tradespeople all throughout the country. So to have a win where we're creating jobs in a community, building homes, and training kids to enter the trades is fantastic and the model that anyone can follow all throughout the country. I also want to highlight some best practices when it comes to incentives. So, what can we do to make it more financially attractive to develop homes and buy homes in our communities? So East Grand Forks, for example, they had a period of time where they were offering $100,000 in interest-free loans for building materials. So if you're a developer and you come and build here, we're going to make it more affordable for you. You get the materials you need, and because it's interest-free, you obviously can then pay that back when the home sells. So if you're looking at helping to get some smaller home builders in to just do maybe one or two infill projects at a time, this is the type of thing that can get those projects going. Greater Fremont, they raised a larger sum of money to be able to provide gap financing to developers. So that is a fantastic strategy because if developers are looking at your community and comparing you to maybe three that are within an hour drive, and you're offering gap financing so they can keep more of their cash flow, your community is going to instantly be more financially attractive, and it would enable them to build more homes than if they had to go somewhere else and maybe come up with that 30% to put towards the project. So that's a hugely beneficial strategy that anyone could do as long as you can raise the right level of capital. And then you also have at the individual level, you have communities that are offering down payment assistance. Very often, this is in conjunction with a local business. So Phelps County, for example, they give part of that down payment and the business gives part of the down payment. So basically, it's designed to help people working in the community come and live in the community. And that's one of your clients too, right, Mark?
Yes, sorry, I was on mute. But yeah, we've worked with Phelps County a couple of times, a couple of campaigns.
Yeah, so they've done some really innovative things like this where they're partnering with the local business community to help solve the problem. And that's one of the things I love about Convergence process is that it really is such a collaborative effort overall.
Actually, Greater Fremont is a past client of ours as well.
Yeah,
That's
that's
cool.
awesome. And in both of those cases, their programs would not have happened if the business community had not seen the value of building these homes because obviously they have workers and it's really hard to attract talent to your company if they don't have a good place to live. So mutually beneficial. All right. Another example that I wanted to give here is what's happening in North Dakota. This is really cool to see how Ellendale Acres is being built up.
Housing happen here in Ellendale. It's an important part of making the data center successful.
This is a pretty simple bill that passed both chambers unanimously, but pretty important for what's going on down here. This is a good bill that'll help this.
So you guys could keep watching this when you get the copy of this presentation, but in essence, this really big investment going into North Dakota with the AI data center required obviously housing to be built. And so through a combination of the incentives at the state level and then also the business's commitment to building housing that would support their workers and others, they're able to get a new 38 unit apartment complex and 20 new homes. And again, it's just an example of how it's so important to collaborate with all of your partners, business partners, and also at the state level and at the regional level. Because housing development is
Housing
not
happen here
something
in
that we can
Ellendale.
just solve alone, right? It's going to take a lot of people working together. One strategy that I wanted to point out today that does not require money as much as it requires internal capacity for your community is what Claremore, Oklahoma did to create pattern zones within their community. Some may refer to that as cluster zoning or pattern zoning. But their story is really interesting because it started with stakeholder engagement. So they brought their community together to ask, what type of homes do you want in our community? What do you need? and where do you want those to go? So they were able to create these clusters where you could look at a map and say, okay, if I want to build a single family home with 5 acres so I can have a huge garden, where am I going to build that? Where it's going to go right here. If I want to build a subdivision, where is that going to go? It's going to go here. If I want multifamily, where's that going to go? So they looked at the entire community, they broke it down in this way. And then they took it one step further. So they actually obtained housing plans for each one of these clusters, and they got those pre-approved. What that did is it meant that when they released this program, any housing developer could contact them and say, I want to build, 10, 1,500 square feet homes in your community. Where do I go? Okay, I go right here. What land is available? This land's available. And by the way, here's your permit. They didn't have to go through the permitting process because the houses were already approved. So it's more of like a snap your fingers and you get your permit after paying the fee versus having to go through that whole process and maybe making changes. So it was so successful that within 60 days of implementation, they had 22 permits filed and obtained. So that's huge. Another thing that is easy to do just to create housing opportunity is to take a look at your downtowns. I mean, if you have a downtown area that has not been activated and the permitting, the zoning right now is not really allowing for residential use, change it, rezone it to make it possible to live downtown. Again, that doesn't take a lot of money, that just takes internal capacity. And if people live downtown, it's actually better for your businesses anyway. And you'll see that we're seeing more often too that even in those downtown spaces, a lot of the older vacant buildings that were industrial in nature or even old hotels are being converted into housing. And that's been pretty successful throughout the country. We have this example from Nebraska, but we've seen that in North Carolina, Georgia, Tennessee, Ohio, you name it. As more people work from home and these buildings sit vacant, now we're seeing old office buildings also converted into housing. So definitely take a look at the assets you have today. One strategy that I personally find to be the most innovative I've ever seen, so I love talking about it, is what they did in Clinton, Iowa. So they needed to have homes built in their community, but they weren't going to be attracting a large developer to Clinton. So they had to think about it a little bit differently, right? If I can't get, a D.R. Horton or somebody to come in, what am I going to do? Probably get people to build one home at a time. But there wasn't land to do that in. They didn't have residential lots ready. And as a community, they didn't have the money to go ahead and immediately buy it. So they did something super innovative where they were able to negotiate the purchase of a piece of land from a local landowner. And then while they were in the process of buying it without it closing, they used their internal resources to subdivide the property and get it ready. They were then able to auction off individual lots. And so they closed and then paid for the land 5 days later. They didn't actually have to carry the cost. Mark, I think you know some of this story too.
Yeah, I love you highlighting this and pointing it out as so innovative because we've actually done a couple of campaigns for Clinton, Iowa as well, and it's great to see that paying off.
Yeah, and they used it to roll with it too, because when they got the money from selling these lots, they got enough to be able to then buy another piece of property to do more housing development. And I think it just speaks to the fact that if you work collaboratively and you really engage people in your community, it's it's not a matter of, the pie being small. It's the pie is a lot larger than sometimes we realize. We just have to get creative and bring more people to the table, which they really effectively did by engaging this landowner. And now you're up, Mark.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate it. Um, well, I'm Mark Bergethon. I'm one of the principals at Convergent Nonprofit Solutions. If you're not familiar with Convergent, we are a national fundraising consulting firm. We're headquartered in Atlanta, but we work all over the country. We're primarily a campaign management company. We manage large fundraising campaigns or conduct the feasibility studies that typically precede those campaigns and position them for success. We actually work for all types of nonprofit organizations, museums, YMCA's, Boys and Girls Clubs, fine arts centers, community colleges, animal shelters, you name it. But by far, our largest market segment is economic development, and we do more fundraising campaigns for economic development organizations and chambers of commerce than any other firm in the country. Our campaigns typically range from about $1 million to all the way up. We're working on one right now that's 150 million. And the money that we raise for our clients is usually for operations, programming, facilities, capital projects, endowments. When we're working for an economic development organization or a chamber of commerce, it's typically to fund operations and programming through a multi-year strategic plan. Go to the next slide. And this is just a sampling of our clients. We've worked with hundreds of economic development organizations all over the country. We've done at least a little bit of work in every state in the country. The bulk of our clients are in the Southeast and the Midwest, I would say. And I've been doing it, my partners and I have been doing this since the 90s. We've been doing it for a long time. We've been doing it as Convergent since a merger in 2009. So we have a lot of historical context, but we recently did an analysis of just the past 3 years to identify some emerging trends. And over that time, span, we've raised $150 million, a little more, for economic development organizations and chambers, ranging from small rural communities to major metro areas. Some of them are standalone EDOs, standalone chambers. Some are blended organizations, multi-organizational regional umbrella partnerships. So pretty much across the board. A lot of them are first-time campaigns. A lot of them are repeat campaigns, all the way up to we're working for Forward Sioux Falls right now in South Dakota on their ninth campaign. They have been doing 5-year funding cycles for 4 decades now. And one of the trends that emerged from this analysis is that economic development organizations and chambers are increasingly becoming conveners and facilitators, tackling major community issues beyond sort of the traditional bread and butter economic development activity that has historically been done. Now that bread and butter, traditional economic development is still being done for sure, right? New business attraction and recruitment, existing industry retention and expansion, product, small business, advocacy. Those are things that we have always helped our clients raise money for. And in this past 3-year period of that $115 million, those activities represented 63% or $72 million. But the thing that I wanted to point out is that 5 years ago, it was more than 75%, and 10 years ago, it was more than 90%. So there's definitely a clear trend towards, the traditional economic development activities not being enough anymore. And so what's replacing it? Go to the next slide. This won't surprise anybody who's listening. 100% of our economic development clients right now are focusing in some aspect on workforce, right? Workforce attraction, workforce retention, workforce development, workforce training, educational, talent pipelines. It is definitely the most sort of ubiquitous thing that we're seeing across the country right now. But some other things that are emerging as growing trends. Housing. 61% of our clients the past few years have had a dedicated housing focus, and that's obviously what we're going to drill down on today. I just want to give this as some context. 52% have a quality of life focus, and 22% focusing on childcare. That's just something that we didn't see not too many years ago. And a smattering of other things. But the housing, quality of life, and childcare really are closely interrelated to workforce development, right? Those are kind of aspects of it. And when we're raising money for those things, it's typically part of a multi-strategy, multi-year strategic plan, and we're raising money to secure multi-year commitments from stakeholders in the community. To drill down on the housing, I'm not a housing expert, but I can share with you what some of our clients are doing across the country. Lee County Economic Development Group, we've done three campaigns for them in Iowa. They've commissioned multiple housing studies, formed task forces to implement strategies. That's kind of the basic, right? I could have named almost any one of our clients who have a housing strategy, and that would essentially be the starting point. The Chamber for Greater Chapel Hill, Carrboro in North Carolina advocated for creating a revolving loan fund and a bond referendum to support affordable housing development, $10 million each. Forward Sioux Falls, I mentioned that's real time. They're proposing a land trust for affordable housing development. The Bloomington Normal Economic Development Council went from no job growth to essentially in 2020 to huge job growth with Rivian and 8,000 new jobs, and that really became it really surfaced the need for scrambling to get housing taken care of. There were, the workers were commuting 45 minutes an hour from Peoria and other surrounding communities, and they've been able to get nearly 5,000 new housing units in the pipeline. So they're being very successful with that. The Greater Oshkosh Economic Development Corporation in Wyoming, in Wisconsin. We actually just, I think, wrapped up this campaign a month or two ago. They're creating an inventory map of potential housing sites and advocating for public infrastructure support for new housing. Uh, Greater Binghamton Forward in New York, supporting pilot programs for single-family housing, streamlining zoning, permitting for new construction. They're looking to increase the regional housing stock by 3% and increase homeownership in targeted zones by 10%. The Greater Topeka Partnership in Kansas, part of one component of their plan, they call a place to live. And one of the objectives for that component is housing for all. And they created a housing advocacy task force, did downtown revitalization planning, and they're really focused heavily on rehabilitated for sale and rental housing and addressing abandoned and vacant properties. And in Gillette, Wyoming, this isn't recent. This is actually uh, a project that I did early in my career, but it was the first time in my career that I encountered an economic development organization that was focused heavily on housing, and really sort of introduced me to those dynamics. At the time, it was Campbell County Economic Development Corporation. They have rebranded more recently as Energy Capital Economic Development. And you can tell from the name of the organization that the local economy is pretty heavily focused on energy and commodities. When I worked with them, it was during a boom in that cycle, and they absolutely did not need new job creation. They were importing workers from around the country. And nearly their entire focus in terms of their program of work and what we were raising money for was addressing the housing issue because they had, the entire housing stock was used up. Virtually all the hotel rooms in town were being used as housing. The major companies were, energy companies were, had constructed man camps and other temporary housing. And so our client focused on marketing the community to housing developers nationwide and, educating them on the need and the opportunity. They promoted and assisted in establishing a local housing authority, and they advocated for expansion of student housing on the local campus in order to free up community housing for the workforce. And I just point that out again because I think that that was an interesting, and maybe just because it was my first one before the recent, trend emerged nationally. That was my first exposure to an economic development organization really focusing on housing as a strategy. And then I want to do a couple of deeper dive case studies. The first one in Henderson, Kentucky. Um, Before we launch into one of these funding campaigns, these investment campaigns, capital campaigns, we typically conduct a feasibility study. It's a funding feasibility study, right? It's the client's due diligence. It's also a process for us to position and plan for a maximally successful campaign. And in 2020, we did a feasibility study for Henderson Economic Development. And, in their preliminary plan that we were testing with stakeholders in the community, major employers, the business community, potential sources of funding, they had job creation targets, capital investment targets, housing start targets, which again is not something that we had seen a whole lot before then. We did the feasibility study, and in our report, we mentioned housing 25 times because it was really a heavy area of focus and concern among the business leaders that we spoke to. And they recognized that that HED was not a housing-centric agency, but they felt that it could be a facilitator, a convener, an advocate, and could help to move the needle on the issue. And so that became that remained a major focus in the final plan that we did a campaign to raise money for. Did revise the 5-year housing starts goal downward. That was really, I think, a function primarily of the pandemic and sort of managing expectations in a really uncertain environment. But we were able to move forward with a capital campaign that was very successful, $2.2 million in both public and private sector support. And just to kind of, give some, drill down on the case study a little bit more, there was a local regional home builder that had built a housing development in Henderson years prior, but didn't have a good experience and essentially withdrew from the community and focused on communities outside of Henderson throughout the region. I won't go into that, but our client, the executive director for the economic development organization, maintained contact, stayed in touch, cultivated that relationship periodically. And then when we did a campaign, our campaign chair sat on a local bank board with the owner of the company. And our client requested a meeting. The campaign chair set it up, and the executive director presented research and data, as Bethany was referring to, on highlighting the need and the opportunity. And the meeting went really well. And at the end of the meeting, the owner of the company said, "How many homes would you like us to build?" And our client said 100 homes because that was our goal. And the home builder responded that he'd be willing to do 300 homes. So a huge, huge win. And that wasn't the end of it. If you go to the next slide, there was actually some need for our client to remain engaged as a facilitator and a convener and almost essentially a broker to get the deal done. There was a site identified, but the price per acre just it wasn't feasible for the price point of homes that needed to be built. And our client was able to negotiate um, uh, that price down, along with a significant tax write-off for the landowner, and also further negotiated a payment arrangement that freed up cash for home building quickly. And there's so far there's 50 homes built and going, and they're going strong. So this is a real-time success story.
It's really innovative too, because you're talking about so many things, right? The negotiation to where they don't have to pay everything up front creates cash flow. The tax write-off makes it affordable to the buyers. Obviously, the community helping to support this program of work. I mean, this is a fantastic story, Mark.
Yeah, thanks. I love that one too.
And
Uh,
I'm going
the
to
next,
insert
yeah,
myself because that's such a fascinating dynamic that economic developers are so familiar with. Coordinating different perspectives and different value propositions around land acquisition and repurposing that your average residential home builder, which is the background of the field that my dad was in growing up, so I've got a little bit of perspective, they're not going to think that way. They're not going to think about the flexibility of tax incentive to leverage a deal like that that's so impactful to a community. So we talk about the role that economic developers and chamber leaders have as facilitators. One of the key reasons they're so well positioned is the diversity of perspective they bring to the table outside of the box. In this case, of how a normal residential land transaction for home building would take place.
yeah, thanks, Brian. That's great. Great addition. The next case study I wanted to go into was the Lawrence Chamber in Kansas. We did a feasibility study for them in 2022, and the preliminary plan that we were testing had four components to it: attraction and recruitment, innovation and entrepreneurship, workforce and talent development, retention and expansion. But as a result of the input and feedback we got from business leaders through the study, we recommended that they revise that plan, combining the attraction, recruitment, the retention, expansion into job creation and economic prosperity, and adding a new component explicitly focused on housing and land development. And so that became a really increased focus for the ultimate plan that was funded in a campaign where we were able to get $2.8 million from the private sector. And just to share that housing and land development component of the plan at a high level, they created a task force. They did a they part of the plan was to conduct a housing needs assessment study, which we've been talking about, and so it's interesting to point out. So a lot of times, the study is done beforehand, and we're raising money to just implement the strategies to address the need that was identified in the study. But in this instance, because the need for the study was identified through our funding feasibility study, it became part of the plan that we were actually raising money to implement. So the money to pay for that study came from the money we raised in the campaign. And they were doing some other things, working with community partners and uh, and addressing new commercial and industrial sites for development as well. So it was housing and land development. The metrics that they targeted, they wanted to within 3 years have adequate land annexed to support 800 housing units, with an annual goal thereafter of issuing at least 300 single-family home permits, and within 5 years have at least 100 acres annex zoned and shovel ready for industrial use. And again, another real-time success story. We're only 3 years into the 5-year program. They've already well exceeded their 800 unit goal and counting, and they've got a lot of other good things that have resulted, including being able to secure some very significant funding from the city for growth-related infrastructure and community expansion. So again, a really good real-time success story. So how do we approach raising money for these types of initiatives? It's through these investment campaigns. The investment campaign model for funding economic development generally is a best practice model that has been utilized by hundreds of economic development organizations nationwide. And at a high level, it essentially means developing a multi-year plan for doing the things that you need to do for your community, whether that's recruiting businesses or workforce development, housing, quality of life, what have you. So it's a multi-year plan, multi-year budget. You establish multi-year goals, and then we go through a campaign to secure multi-year pledge commitments to underwrite that plan. The organization focuses on implementing the plan, attaining the goals, and in the process, providing a return on investment to those stakeholders. And then at the end of the multi-year cycle, it's typical for that organization to create a new plan, updated plan, new budget, set new goals, and justify a new round of investment to their stakeholders. And it's typical, you know, to increase both funding and outcomes cycle over cycle. And there are some organizations that are in their fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth. Mentioned Forward Sioux Falls ninth 5-year cycle and have been doing this for decades. A few key features of this approach I want to point out is that it is typically a public-private partnership in the sense of both funding and leadership coming from both the public and private sector. There are certainly we've had clients that are fully private. There are plenty of economic development entities out there that are 100% public, and those aren't usually our clients unless they're bringing us in to build a public-private partnership and get the private sector to the table. But we've seen every mix of public-private funding that you can imagine. But what we consider to be a best practice is the private sector outweighing the public sector from a funding perspective. And we like to see something in the neighborhood of 60-40, 70-30, two-thirds, one-third, something like that, with the private sector, driving the effort. Multi-year, long-term, again, these are, these are, it's not annual dues. It is multi-year investment, 3 to 5 years. In most cases, there are some 3-year cycles, some 4-year cycles, but 5 years is the most common. Most of the examples that I shared, the clients that I pointed out are on a 5-year cycle. And investment focus. I think if you go to the next slide, that it'll help me to delve into this aspect of it. We don't think of this funding as donations or gifts or contributions or philanthropy or charity or membership or sponsorships. We talk about investment and we position the funding as an investment, not even in the organization, an investment in this plan that is going to produce a return for the investor. And so it's all about demonstrating the ROI, the return on investment, and that can be very direct in the case, if we're talking about housing, it can be very direct in the case of developers and home builders. For example, it can also be pretty direct if you're talking about the major employers who need positions filled, but can't get them filled because there's not enough workforce housing. That's a pretty direct ROI. But you can also demonstrate a return on investment to the rest of the business community in an indirect way. I think you can go to the next slide, Bethany. Just in terms of growing the pie, right? Growing the local economic output that is going to help businesses who participate in that local economy to grow themselves. And so, for example, if we're, you know, if we're, you know, economic developers always talk about the impact and value of job creation. Well, there's really no value to the job until it's fulfilled, and oftentimes it can't be fulfilled unless there's adequate workforce housing. And so, if you connect those dots and talk about how filling those jobs adds however many hundreds of millions of dollars in annual payroll to the local economy, and you look at personal consumption expenditure patterns, you can model out how that added payroll gets redistributed into the local economy, whether it's paying taxes, paying utility bills, buying groceries, purchasing automobiles, making bank deposits, you can show how almost any sector of the local economy is going to grow from the work that you're doing. And in doing so, you can eventually get to the point where, doesn't it make sense to invest X in order to get Y? And so it does become a true ROI. And so really, we're just trying to um, we want the business community to incorporate our clients' program of work into their portfolio of strategies for growing their own businesses. Businesses are going to invest to grow, right? And this is one way of doing it. Yeah, Bethany, if you want to wrap us up, I think we're near the end.
Sorry, Mark, I was trying to pay attention to when you might need to go to the next slide, and I think I went 2 slides too far. Do you need me to back up at all?
I'm good.
You are, okay. So I think a lot of what you just said at the end, though, was so important. The ability to tie in how what you're doing to obviously raise money, what's in it for me, right? And ultimately, that's what we're talking about today is the interconnected nature of economic development and how we have to create housing in order to make sure people can come to the community to fulfill the jobs that your business community needs. When those jobs are fulfilled, they're going to be shopping at local businesses who's going to create more jobs, right? And so it's this very cyclical effect. And that's one of the things that I think is so fantastic about the Convergent approach is that you paint that picture and make it really clear for all stakeholders in the community. So kudos to you guys for that. I think that's why it's so powerful to work with you. And then also, as far as what we do at Golden Shovel, if anyone's at a place where you are ready to start marketing to housing developers, that's where we come in because we can help to bring in the developers that you need. And of course, if Convergence raised all that money for you, you'll have the budget to pay for the attraction campaign. But otherwise, we do have a free white paper for anyone who's watching. You can go to our website and download. That's going to have more recommendations for how to increase workforce housing, along with significantly more best practices. I think we only covered like 5 today, and there's probably a good 40 in here. In addition, Convergent has a fantastic white paper that you should also download as far as a guide to raising money. And I think we're handing it off to Brian.
Yeah, thank you both so much for sharing those great examples. Sorry for my host license of interrupting there in the middle, but I do just think it's such a phenomenal different perspective economic developers bring to this conversation. And if we can tell anything from looking at the scenario around the country with, as you shared data at the beginning, maybe the caveat, Bethany, of the Southeast, there's a need to think outside the box because this is one of the most critical dynamics for workforce. And we know that workforce is what is helping communities win projects and attract jobs or secure expansions, right? So it's just absolutely crucial. We are right down here near the end of our time. I've got a couple of really quick questions that I want to throw out there. Bethany, you mentioned this marketing to housing developers. My guess, based on a lot of the strategic plans that we've helped fund for economic developers, they're used to marketing to site selectors and other consultants for industrial growth. Where do you even start in thinking differently about how to market to residential developers?
Yes, that's a really good question. And hopefully, when you're at that point, you do have data, as we mentioned, through a housing study to back up why there is an immediate need and be able to quantify that. So that's definitely something we recommend. Housing developers typically have a niche. So, for example, if you're trying to market to senior housing developers who really don't care that you need a new multifamily complex built for students, you're not going to be very effective in that marketing. So one of our approaches is that you have to understand your target audience, and that's not just housing developers, but it's really the same level of thought you'd put towards your target industries. So put that towards housing developers as well. The other side is that you really have to market your community's quality of life because housing developers are risk adverse. They do not want to build in a community where people don't want to live. So showcasing your wonderful parks and school system and the restaurants that you have and your, the low crime rates and just what a beautiful place it is to raise a family is going to be really important part of that storytelling. So you almost need to put on your tourism workforce attraction hat while simultaneously making the business case for how they can profit and have low risk by building in your community.
So for those communities that have that need, they need those houses today. What's step one? What's the first thing a community, whether it's an economic developer leading the way or coming alongside other community leaders, what's the first thing that needs to happen for this to move forward?
Mark, either one of us can take that.
Yeah, I would say the housing study, right? I mean, find out, put parameters on what the real need is, and the housing mix that's needed. Get the data, get the
Mhm.
data, and then you can form your plans around that. Um, I, I did point out the example of where the housing study wasn't done until we were doing a campaign. So I mean, if so it doesn't, as long as you're doing the housing study before trying to address the housing need, I think that's the critical thing. A first step from a fundraising perspective is to do a funding feasibility study to determine how much can be raised, what can be achieved, how best to achieve it, and we can help you. Convergent can help you with that. You have anything to add, Bethany?
Yeah, I mean, it really comes down to what's your roadmap. I was talking to someone about this today. As an economic developer, you're tasked with creating a resilient economy in your community, right? A place that is going to be successful long term, where people can have generations of families succeeding there, right? And it comes down to what that roadmap looks like. Housing is a part of that. That's where your housing study comes in. The feasibility study is a part of that. And I know that that's kind of hard for our economic developers sometimes to communicate to their board. Why do we have to invest in that plan? Again, why do we have to invest in that feasibility study? And the reality is, if you don't have it, if you don't have that roadmap, where are you going to go? What are you building for your community? So even though it's not maybe the most attractive answer to a board, you do have to start by creating a plan.
Yeah, and that opportunity for community buy-in is the
Mhm.
way we use the example of Lawrence, Kansas, right? Uh, the demand for them to address housing was a result of that feasibility study.
Yeah.
And it was the motivating factor, the catalyst for their leadership and their community rallying around a vision that was going to set them up for what they needed, as you said, Bethany, to thrive in the future, to be that vibrant, economically growing community. And it got everybody fired up about it. So um, great content here. Thanks so much for sharing guidance to find both of those white papers and all that goes along with those. Excited to have had the opportunity to talk through these dynamics around housing. And thank you both so much for sharing these points of expertise today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for hosting us. Have a wonderful day.
Thanks a lot.